Before we get started with today's podcast, I want to let you know that today's guests, Richard Freeman, Mary Taylor, Tim Feldmann, and Kino MacGregor, will all be teaching at this year's Ashtanga Yoga Confluence, May 1st through 4th in San Diego, California. Also teaching will be Dina Kingsburg and Jack Wiseman, who both inspired this season of the podcast, and also many other truly great teachers from within our Ashtanga Yoga community. Plus, partial scholarships are available. I'll include the link to the confluence in the show notes. I hope you can attend. Also, Megan and I will begin accepting applications for the fall session of our mentorship program starting in May. You can find this and other ways to study with us all on the website. Visit ashtangadispatch.com. Welcome to a brand new season of the Ashtanga Dispatch podcast. I'm Peg Mulqueen, your host. As I said before, this season was inspired by a camping trip that I took with Megan, her husband Mark, and Dina and Jack back in January. One of my favorite evenings was just the five of us sitting around the tent, talking and telling stories. Mostly it was Dina and Jack telling stories, like how they met, some of their early trips to India, what it was like then, what practice was like then. We were talking about that evening the next day with one of Dina's friends, Becky, and it was she that suggested that maybe that's how we format the podcast this year, that we bring people together in conversation, just like we did around the campfire, so to speak. So instead of the regular interview format that you might be used to, this season we'll be bringing together various teachers around various subjects and just having normal conversations about those topics. Anyway, I thought it was brilliant. Certainly would be something that I would listen to, and I hope you will as well. And to kick off the season, I bring you none other than Mary Taylor, Richard Freeman, Tim Feldmann, and Kino MacGregor. I feel like these four teachers don't need an introduction, but I'm going to attempt one anyway. Richard and Mary have been students of yoga since the late 60s, early 70s, and they're rooted in the Buddhist tradition as well. They've authored and co-authored numerous books, including their most recent, Feeling Happy, the Yoga of Body, Heart, and Mind. And their month-long Teachers Intensive is one of those trainings that every teacher dreams of attending, including this one. They also do studio talks once a month, and I encourage you to check those out as well, because these two teachers are probably the kindest, most compassionate, and knowledgeable human beings I know. To say I look up to them is an understatement. Tim and Kino are co-founders of Miami Life Center, Miami Yoga Garage, and are both certified teachers of Ashtanga Yoga. In fact, the two first met in India over 20 years ago through Ashtanga Yoga. As a student, I've always enjoyed Tim's unique perspective in regards to movement and alignment. It likely comes from his years as a dancer and choreographer. But even more, it's the sweetness he brings into the room, as well as his devotion. And Kino is one of those women who is a true trailblazer. The founder of omstars.com, author of many books, and a prominent figure not just within the Ashtanga yoga community, but within the global yoga community. With over 1 million followers on Instagram, Kino uses all of her social media platforms to share her message that yoga is for everyone. Anyway, to have these two amazing couples on the podcast together feels like a pipe dream, especially given their schedules and locations, but they managed to make it work across time zones, and through power outages. Yes, and you'll actually hear in the podcast when Mary and Richard's power comes back on. Still, they made this episode happen, not for me, but for you, because community is important, and ours is suffering right now. As you'll hear Richard say, our practice is one of connection and relationship, which is indeed our topic for today. The tradition that connects us, drawing a line between past, present, and future. Here's Mary, Richard, Kino, and Tim.
Richard, Mary, Kino, Tim, thank you so much for all coming together. I know we're all in different places, and coordinating the schedules is kind of tricky, but this one is important. This one, I'm just so glad I have all four of you together. So thank you.
Thank you.
Before we before we begin, I just want to acknowledge that everyone is still very much grieving the loss of Sharath. Even those who may have only known him through their teachers, but perhaps especially those of you sitting here. Sharath was a tremendous human being and teacher. His passing has left a hole, I think, in all of us and in our Ashtanga community. But this one thing I remember Sharath saying to me in a podcast many years back, and it was this: it's always about the yoga, not him. He repeated this, he emphasized this to Megan and me in that podcast a few times. The yoga is bigger than me. And why I brought you four together to talk about our yoga tradition and what it means and what it will mean, because I think this speaks to the fear many are feeling as well.
You're correct. There's a big hole in all of our hearts at this moment, and we're, it's a time where we feel, Richard and I feel, I think, that being able to connect with other members of this community is how we will get through this time, and not that we will ever fill that hole, but that the feeling of rawness within that space within us will start to get mended as we connect with each other. So we appreciate you pulling all of us together, and we're so happy to see you, Kino and Tim, and yeah.
Well, the highlights of the tradition are moments of connection. No matter how far back you go, historically, it's when there's the connection, that's the yoga. It's like, wow, I've connected. In little ways or big ways. And so, let's connect.
Yes, and I can totally agree. There's a big void is kind of probably what I feel. And we tried it before, Kino and I, and so have you, Peg and Mary and Richard, all. When Sharath Jois passed, there was a big void there, and it seems to be so in the world that when the king dies, the land falls into chaos a little bit, and that seems to also be happening. But I'm very optimistic. We were there in February. We really enjoyed it to be there, and both Kino and I feel that there is a path forward, which is not necessarily a given, but we can't see anything else than this is going to continue. Sharath, he was the head for a good while, and now he's not here anymore. But as you mentioned, he said himself, the yoga is bigger than him.
I think what Tim might be referring to is there seems to be like a lot of fear that's there, like what's going to happen next? Or maybe it's not fear, maybe it's just I want to know how kind of we go forward. And maybe that's just a natural thing that we do as human beings. We want to, in the face of uncertainty, we want certainty, and does anybody want to like speak to that? It's left me a little uncomfortable because I don't have any answers, and I don't know that we're in a place right now where I think the questions are there, but answers are not.
Yeah, we want to know. And that's our natural ego function, is you want to know because you want to protect what you think is valuable, including yourself, or whatever that is. And then perhaps the selves of others, you want to protect them and serve them. And so we want to know. But we want to know something. But ultimately, in the realm of yoga, when you get a taste of it, you suspend knowing. You just go into the state of awe, and you don't know. And so this is kind of whenever the going gets, difficult, we just, I got to know so I know what to do. Um,
And I think too that it's, during periods like that where the practices themselves teach us to be in the moment at hand. And that's one of the things that has kept me involved with Ashtanga Yoga for so very long, is that I, like everyone, have been through so many different things personally and etc. And the consistency is that day after day after day, one gets on the mat and or sits in meditation or does some chanting, etc. And 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 what is of value and what is grounding in those practices is that we're right there in the moment doing the practice. We're feeling it, we're thinking it, we're not thinking about, well, what about tomorrow? What's going to happen next? And and in this time and in all times of transition, really, that's what keeps us grounded so that we can sort through so many things that are presenting themselves and that will continue to present themselves, to know what is what how do we go on from here, rather than saying, well, how will we go on? We go on moment by moment, and the practice is what keeps us in that uh, process of being able to do that. And for us, that's what it was like when Guruji died also, is that there was this feeling of change and shock and all of that, but it was very different because he was older and we were more expecting it, and then there was a sort of logical step, this is what's going to happen next, and yet we were preparing for this moment. And Sharath himself, my experience with him as a fellow practitioner and dear sweet Sharath, is that he always was wanting to be in the moment at hand, and that's what you looked into his face and it was just this face of pure joy, that he could, where he would just look so deeply, and that wasn't a face saying, well, what's happening tomorrow? It's like, what's happening right here right now. And so yeah, it's a natural sort of response to think, oh dear, what's going to happen? But and that's why it seems to me that coming together and saying, this is, we're all feeling things like this, and how do we not push it down, but how do we not, sort of make it into a fantasy? Let's be with what's here.
And Richard and Mary, I really like what you both said about first you, Richard, about this question of the need to know, also really connected into a desire to protect what we believe is valuable, and that kind of razor's edge of fear, protection. At the same time, these are the very obstacles, as you said, Mary, that our practice teach us to sort of sit with. And Peg, you referenced what Sharath said in this podcast, where he said it's not about him, it's about the yoga or the teaching. And when we think about, what is tradition, I feel like we're not the only ones who have ever lost our teacher and our friend. This has been an experience that generations of yoga practitioners have felt. And I feel like one of the things that Tim and I see as being a real source of hope is that there are still many students who love this practice, like ourselves, and people all over the world that are just in love with this practice. And I feel that's a great source of hope and inspiration, that as long as there are people who love the practice, then they're willing to step on the mat and go into that space of awe, as you said, Richard, and just experience that sort of power of the practice. And maybe that's all we really need to be aware of, is that there are people that are practicing, and if we can support those people, and if we can be supported as practitioners ourselves, I think that's a place of faith and hope for myself, and maybe for others as
And
well.
that's so well said, Kino. And another thing with that practice that everyone who I know who's practiced with the Ashtanga system has happened is you have a problem, or you have something that's bothering you, and you get on the mat and you don't necessarily think, well, I'm going to sort it out, but you do the practice, and then somehow this alchemy happens, and part way through the practice, or as you step off the mat, suddenly the whatever it was that was sort of bugging you before has morphed and turned into something that you understand or have absorbed, and so it speaks to that.
It's not like you're trying to get rid of
No.
your mind. You're a bad mind for worrying about things. But as you practice, you can be mindful of your mind being neurotic, or worrying, or grasping, and that's incorporated into the breath and the movement of the practice. And so you go, oh, and that helps. But it is all of a sudden, you haven't made the world perfect, as we say. Well, it's already perfect, but you haven't eliminated the ego, or your neurotic. The neurotic part of your mind is still functioning very well, and well, hopefully it will. As long as you're embodied, you need to have uh, a neurotic, But you also want to be able to see that and practice with it, or rather than trying to deny it or get rid of it. And I think, the whole Ashtanga extended community, which is probably more than I think it is, that's what's happening. And we need to just keep on doing it. Communicating occasionally, but practicing.
The practice itself is so powerful. And I don't think I ever realized just how deeply rooted it was in me before I even practiced yoga. I grew up Catholic, and my grandmother helped raise me for the first 5 years. And every night before we went to bed, we would say the rosary. We would pray the rosary. So that's how I learned to pray, with my grandmother kneeling by my bedside. And it was really special. And she made a big impact on me. Obviously, as I got older, Catholicism didn't really resonate for many reasons, but the rituals did. I missed them. I missed the praying. I missed the repetition. I missed the ritual. I missed, yeah, all of that. And I think when I look back, I realize that I think that's kind of what drew me to Ashtanga in many ways. There was that same ritualistic, the predictable, the reaching up, the bowing down, the praying, the community, the early mornings or late nights, what it was, was switching one for the other. And those things have carried me through some really difficult times. And although it's a different tradition, sometimes I think it's not.
There are many rituals.
Well, there's certainly the ritual to the practice without a doubt. And there's certainly like some type of prayer, I think is very different for every person that practices, and I think it changes. For instance, for years and years, I would get on my mat and I would say our opening invocation, kind of as a way to get myself inspired and connect in with the tradition. And the last couple of years, it's been maybe more practical for me. Like the first line, Vande Gurunam Charanarvinda, is for me all about asking for some help. Like personally, it just maybe like give me a little bit of help because I really don't want to practice right now. So can you give me a little fire here so I can make it through today, or that I can maybe find some curiosity, some inspiration to do that. And that little ritual is both meaningful but also helpful to me. It connects me in to that place where I don't just automatize and follow the straight up dogma, but I'm try to make that moment my own, that moment on the mat there. So for me, that is perhaps comparable to what you felt when you were 5.
Yeah, Tim, I think there's that element of devotion, which is something that we've been talking about recently. And just this question of, what does it mean to find devotion within the Ashtanga Yoga practice? How can asana be an act of devotion, be, in the Sanskrit, the act of pranidhana? How is it a devotional act? And how do we create that the sacred space? How do we create the idea of giving of ourselves, especially when we have the absence of our teacher, because the guru, the teacher, very much was this receptacle of devotion and surrender. So now this question of sort of a guru-less space brings up a question of how does the devotional nature of the practice change without the one to whom we would bow down being present any longer. And so I think that this is a very much a question in process. We were talking about recently how the if we find the word pranidhana, and I think you said it was to deposit. And if our guru and our teacher kind of held the deposits of all of our all of our supplications and all of our surrender over all of those years, well, where are those deposits now? And to whom do we offer each time we, bow down? And into what do we step? And so these are, I think, very important questions that I think are that I'm sitting with now. And at the same time, there starts to be this question of, are there aspects of the tradition that require a sense of devotional service in order to save and preserve things that might get lost as, the generation changes, and things that, never got documented and sort of, really just really systematized in a way that could preserve the knowledge for future generations. So it's something I think is a ongoing question and topic of conversation.
Kino, you said something that I think that really helped explain what I was trying to say. It was losing my grandma and kind of switching over. I missed her, and I felt very much like I had left her. I had left that ritual she taught me. I had left that essence that tradition that we had shared. And it took me a long time to realize that it just had changed for me. You know, Richard, you talk a lot about taking things very literally, you know, and the problems with that, the things that we fall into. And I think I was taking that tradition of prayer with her so literally that I had felt I had abandoned it in the way it had reformed and re-emerged in my life. And I think that's what I was, you know, that's kind of, that line for me had changed. And so there's this like conundrum. Does it change? Or like you were saying also, Kino, what do we need to preserve for it to remain within the tradition?
So as Tim was saying, he does invocate Vande Guru Nam Charanar, and the actual translation is Guru Nam is plural. To the many gurus, there are 2 feet. There are 2 feet that are used, yet there's a plurality of gurus. And then the next verse is Sadashiva Bhaktani. Sadashiva is now talking that within you in the Triveni, you can come across what you should actually pay attention to as the teacher, which is arising. And he calls it Nadanu Sandhana, or the total mindfulness of nada, which is the getting absorbed primarily. Nada is usually interpreted as sound, but it's also sight and touch. So the arising of sensation is actually the guru that's manifesting in all beings. And so people should pay attention to what's right in front of them rather than, but if they're other concept, you know, of they have a picture of helps them to actually experience what's right in their face, so to speak. Then it's excellent. It's a way of learning to pay attention.
Which, you know, in a way is what Sharath was insinuating when he's saying it's not about me, it's about the teachings. And yet, as students, it is so helpful to have the reference point of a teacher and the resonance with another human being who we feel is a deeply committed person, that we can then, you know, kind of blossom into that space you're talking about, Richard, within ourselves. Because if you're doing that all by yourself, it could get a little bit wonky pretty quickly, you know.
Yes.
So our power just came on, so we can,
Okay,
we can
that's
plug in if
wonderful.
needed.
The one thing that I have heard from students that write me, and it was interesting, after Sharath passed, they were grieving. And then they felt bad for grieving because they said, I didn't know him. How could I be sad? And it was something, Mary, that you were saying, we need that. And you all have been saying that we need that person in front of us and that carrying on of, and we're all connected in that way because our teacher's teacher and that connection. So of course, I remind them, of course, you're feeling the loss. Absolutely. You don't have to know somebody personally to actually know someone through someone else, I think.
Tim, you said people said that to you as well?
Yeah, I think there's a simplicity in what Mary was describing. To have an idol, to have a statue, to have a teacher, to have someone up there in front that embodies all the stuff that we are after, all those beautiful qualities that we hope to cultivate inside of ourselves. And when, in this case, Sharath was kind of like that for us, so many people, you know, the physical representation of the higher consciousness of yoga and stuff like that, whether we knew him or not. And I think when you take him out of the picture, then we're back to the uncertainty. We're back to that confusion that comes there. And even perhaps is what Kino was talking about, if the devotion is not so clear and the understanding or the connection with the yoga and what yoga is not so concrete in ourselves, then it gets perhaps even more difficult. So perhaps people who didn't go to Mysore, people who didn't have a guru or a grand teacher or whatever it's called, perhaps even more difficult. Where to go now, whether perhaps the seasoned practitioner can somehow transform, can make that transmission, but perhaps more difficult for the newer practitioner.
I think what Richard had said too before was it's about connections and relationships, and we can grieve. I mean, it's more complex than just one-to-one. There's a relationship that's bigger, that goes back deeper, or, you know, that relationship with my teacher is also connected to my teacher's relationship with their teacher.
It's like with parents, you know, you have 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, 16 great-great-grandparents. And it just keeps getting, but it goes back, and so there's some depth to it that we intuit. And so how many great grand teachers or gurus are there? There's a whole amazing amount of amazing beings that, you know, we'll never learn most of their names, but they have a consistent message, and we intuit that. Oh, there's more to this than. So you can feel, you know, it's quite stunning. So you don't actually, even if you don't have the honor or privilege of actually getting to know the teacher on a personal level, if you just have kind of I just saw them, you know, and we exchanged, you know, that's a great blessing. You glanced, you know, you met them in the alley, and you go, oh, and you're just like, for just 2 minutes or 10 seconds, that can be like that connection. And sometimes, you know, people have taught, well, sometimes that's an advantage to actually living in the guru's house, you know, and working with them on a daily basis, which can be quite complex.
You don't want to see the guru's laundry.
Peg, you said something about maybe the slightly impersonal connection, meaning that if people express this question of, I don't know why I'm sad, I'd never met him. But if we think about what Sharathji represented to the Ashtanga community and what his grandfather represented to the Ashtanga community, it's like we've lost them both. And you know, there's, as you brought up Catholicism, you know, there are how many Catholics in the world that never meet the Pope, but mourn when the Pope is gone. And, you know, the teaching of Catholicism isn't, you know, dependent on the Pope, and yet the Pope is an important figurehead. And in some ways, Pattabhi Jois Guruji was our Ashtanga Pope for a little while, and Sharathji was our Ashtanga Pope for many people for a little while. And then, you know, there's no conclave happening right now, and the Catholicism has a, you know, 1,000-year-old system of choosing the successor. And, you know, right, in Ashtanga Yoga, from Pattabhi Jois Guruji to his grandson, there was a clear kind of relation. But nevertheless, that's not something I think we need to try to recreate on the model of Catholicism. But it's more this idea that when there's a personal practice or a personal relation, and we feel invested in something, when the person who represented that place within our heart no longer is here, there's a loss. And this is true whether it's the Pope or whether it's like when David Bowie died. Tim was really, really, you were really impacted by that.
I was depressed for a week.
And I mean, it's not my generation, so I was a little bit like, okay, like, you're really sad. Like, did you really, like, okay. But I was trying to be supportive because that,
You look great.
okay. Yeah. I was scratching my head going like, David Bowie is having this impact on my husband, but like, okay. And then I was thinking, who as a remote person would have that impact? And it was hard for me to come up with something like that. But I feel like when, for example, there have been these pivotal times when a public figure that means something to someone passes away, suddenly, JFK was assassinated. People remember exactly where they were on that day forever. Everyone in the Ashtanga community will not forget where they were when they heard the news of Sharath Jois passing. Pattabhi Jois Guruji may be similar, but again, as Mary, you said, we were expecting him to pass. He was older. It's a different shock value. Not that the loss is any less, but the shock value, the trauma of it was a little bit less. And I think that regard anybody who in any way has practiced any yoga, as Richard, as you mentioned, that is in any way connected with the whole yoga tree in which Pattabhi Jois Guruji and Sharath Jois all fit within, they're feeling the loss in the same way that, people that never met the Pope, never met JFK, never met Martin Luther King Jr., never met John Lennon, like all these people that suddenly might be gone that represented something of great value and devotion in our hearts. It's a time of loss and reflection, and a time of mourning, and a time of uncertainty.
And Kino, exactly. It's important to not ignore that, or to not try to not grieve.
Mm-hmm.
It is important to allow the grieving process, which goes in phases that are different for everyone. And it's important not to push it down, push it away. And we grieve, I think there's a quote that I'm trying to remember who it is. I'll think of it in a moment. But the quote is that grief is love with no place to go. And that's what this experience is for so many of us. And the love is both towards Sharath, and it's towards the practice that has opened something in us that is deep. So it's this profound loss, thinking, well, then that's going to die because this person who represents it is no longer with us. And so the love has to be allowed to kind of wander a little bit and find, oh no, I'm still here. And I still have this feeling from Sharath, even though he's not here. I still have the feeling from, you have it from your grandmother, even though she's not here, etc. And it's really important to let the grief go in the process and the phase that it needs to go for each one of us as an individual.
So it might be very different.
It is always different for everyone, I think.
And so there's some schools of psychology. Oh, you should grieve for a few months, or then you need therapy, or you should not. But it might be for as long as we're around, or for a few lifetimes, maybe.
Yeah. So
if we switch microphones,
we have one more thing, Peg, which is
yes,
we're about to run out of batteries. So our microphone is plugged in to where the battery needs to be plugged in. So we're gonna just do that.
But
so the sound quality may be slightly different, but it'll still be good through the phone. Okay.
But better that you keep the power on.
Yeah. This is like a comedy of errors with elderly people trying to Yeah, using using modern things.
I'm always holding my phone upside down. What's happening?
Just the fact that we can all get together in such different places under such different circumstances in different times is, I think, a testament to all of us.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
this is amazing.
Yeah, this kind of thing, it gives me great hope because, things like this, you get to connect all around the whole planet.
Mm-hmm.
And although it used to take ages, for people from your tribe to wander over the mountain and fight with the people on the other side of the hill and then eventually communicate with them. And
yeah,
it just took ages.
This reminds me, too, of something we were thinking this afternoon about this dialogue that we'd have with all of us together. And Richard was looking at old emails. We were looking at things we had said to Sharath and found one from 2015 that was an email to Sharath when we had, made a film called Guruji Lives Here. And it was written across people's chests, Guruji lives in our hearts. And we'd written to Sharath about it and said, this is why we've done it. And, we wanted to take the proceeds and donate them to something he wanted, blah, 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 blah. But that's, these people live on forever. And what was amazing about that and the idea behind it, it was to celebrate Patabi Jois's 100th birthday, was that people we solicited people from all over the world just standing there, doing their practice. People chanting in all different time zones. And my idea in coming up with that film was that at almost every single hour of every single day, you have someone starting the Ashtanga series, rolling out their mat, standing there doing it, and then in a time zone an hour later, someone else is coming out and doing that. And so this idea that this is this web that is really what keeps this alive. It's this, and that being able to communicate among those of us who are part of that net is what will help us through difficult times together. And it is 24 hours a day. Someone is starting their practice somewhere.
And you can start, it doesn't have to be on the hour.
No, it doesn't have to be on the hour. Only if you're OCD like me.
Yeah, for some people. And also, it's important for Ashtangis to realize that you can still follow the Ashtanga methodology, even if you can't quite do Ekam really well. And sometimes because your arms are broken, and you can't, but you can do Ekam without your arms. In other words, the principles of inhaling and exhaling, and then the action and counteraction, which is what the vinyasa actually is about. That can be done, by little people and then old people, and so. But everyone thinks, "Oh, I have to be in perfect shape," and I have to buff and ready.
And we're here to prove that that's not true. As you get older, you can still do it.
Yeah, a whole series for us is just
I'm right there in your footsteps. Today, in regards to that, the practice is still here and leads us on. So, Kina, we were teaching Mysore style yoga here today in Taipei. And there was a lady who was doing an asana, Vatayanasana, and she placed her heel in a place in regards to her knee, in a place I hadn't seen quite before. So I walked over to her and I said, I have learned it differently. There's some, people, some of my friends, they put here and here. This is what I have learned. When I was young, I was told to put it there. When I got a little older, I was allowed to put it there. And we had a whole conversation, and the lady, she was so interested, and the curiosity about where to put the heel in regards to her knee. It's such a small detail in one asana out of the whole series she was doing. And I walked away and I thought, this is living. It's still there. This is such a ridiculous detail. And look how interested we are in it. It was a very nice moment.
Sweet, yeah.
Mm.
And how different it can be, and how we can allow for those differences, like we're still, people are so unique. And I think what Richard was saying is really true. I think a lot of times people think they have to fit a certain mold or, practice a certain way in order to be a part of that tradition.
Yeah, Sharath used to say quite often, your asana does not impress me, your kindness will impress me. And that's something that I feel like we need to remember over and over again, and ourselves included, because how often do we slip out of kindness into judgment, and to go and then when those moments of pride slip in, how easy is it to forget that the yoga is not the asana, and that someday the asanas may fall away. And also from the outside looking in, we don't know really what's happening. Someone may be genetically blessed and able to bend and lift, and someone may not have that same genetic advantage and not have the privilege of just a vastly able body, and yet be really inspired for the practice. And that's something that Sharath started to be more and more welcoming towards, is really, adaptations, variations, and inclusivity in the practice. That was kind of his last teaching before he passed, was this, active series that his daughter and Andrew Hillam are now taking forward in the world. And so I think that's something that Ashtanga Yoga really, really needs, is to understand that the inner work is something that we can't judge by how far our leg goes behind our head or how many advanced poses we're doing, because, like, again, if it was just this asana competition, I'm sorry to say, but I think all of the circus performers would have us all beat in a moment. We have a student of ours that is nearly 60, and he's a lifelong circus performer and world famous acrobat, and there is no asana he cannot do on the first try.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Richard is famous for saying, when that you're blessed with stiffness.
Yes.
That
Blessed are the
part
stiff.
means that blessed are the stiff. You're blessed with stiffness because you just have to lift your arm, a quarter of an inch, and you have sensation patterns that you can meditate on. And you used to say that to me as a stiff person. I used to think, is he making fun of me, or is it really? Is he, but it's true. It's like the stiffness has some benefit.
I'm glad you brought up the active series, because it seems to me there were seeds planted right there. There seemed, I heard Andrew speaking, I think at his memorial, at Sharath's memorial, and he was saying this was deeply important to him, to make this available and accessible to everyone.
He's been talking about it for some years. Some years back, when he was teaching with us in Miami, we were driving him to the Shala from his hotel early in the morning. And we were sitting there in the car, and he was very quiet. And then suddenly he said, I've been thinking that maybe we should remove Marichasana D and Supta Kurmasana from primary series. And I was driving the car, and Kino sitting in the back, and Kino fainted, and I almost crashed the car. We had never heard him say anything like that before. So but then there was a
Wow.
conversation, and then over the years he was like talking a little bit more about that idea, and then last year presenting that series, which was such a different message somehow than how we usually perceive Ashtanga Yoga.
And he became so much more welcoming of people's different bodies and the need to adapt the practice for the student that's in front. And the interesting thing though is that while we may be thinking of this as something new, in fact, it wasn't new. And I mean, Richard and Mary, you probably saw Pattabhi Jois Guruji teach all different types of students differently. And we remember seeing all different types of bodies in the shala, including, a double amputee and people with medical issues that were taught totally differently. So the idea of accessibility for me actually is the heart of what Mysore style is about, rather than just creating a performance of, highly able bodies. It's okay, here's people that want to do this inner quest of awakening, and then here are some tools, and how can we make these tools available to those who show up and want them?
Exactly.
Yeah, the whole Mysore style is, so each person is doing, an adaptation. Some of them, severe adaptations, but if you have a led class, the ideal is that it's almost like something choreographed in a military setting, in which each student is exactly the same as the one next to them, and and it's scary.
Yeah, and with me, that's what Pattabhi Jois did. He stopped me the first day at Parivrtta Trikonasana and said, "You go sit down. You got a long way to go." And then he even changed those postures. Have your feet this way. Do this, and then and and Sharath was right in and out of the room, watching that, knowing that, and the tradition itself. What Krishnamacharya was into, etc. That's part of it, and it's part of what in the more modern Ashtanga world has taken grip of. Part of it is that that you cannot do anything outside of the this particular sequence and this particular manner, and that's because again it comes back, I think, to this need to know, to not really go deep into oneself, but to have something that's a structure that you then can rely on, and I don't have to do it I'm not good enough or whatever to do it myself, and that's that's not really the way any of these traditions developed, and so it's and with him coming up with this new sequence, and I remember taking a class online with Sharath during the pandemic, and him, saying exactly that, Tim, that you were saying, that, do whatever you want to do, not whatever you want to do, but do what is right for your body. Do not hurt yourself in these poses. And I was thinking, gosh, is he seeing me? Of course, it always turns around to the neurotic person, like, uh-oh, am I doing it that badly? But, but then I was like, oh my goodness, this is wonderful to hear. And this was years ago. And so it's a wonderful thing that and like your new book, Kino, that you're bringing this in and saying, yeah, it's okay, and it's okay to be doing third series. Those are fine.
Mm-hmm. I really like the idea of the inclusivity of, it's okay to adapt the poses, and it's also okay to pursue a high level of athleticism in the asana if that's appropriate, so that it's not an either or. And that it's okay. I feel like an amazing Mysore room would be to have someone adapting the practice on a chair next to someone doing, advanced A, B section, and then to have a brand new student come in and just be learning the series. I think that would be a really inspiring Mysore room. And I feel like there's space for everyone then.
It kind of is happening already.
It is.
I feel like equipping the Ashtanga Yoga community with the tools of accessibility is also important.
Yes.
Having the sort of teachers and leaders in the community really understand how to adapt the asanas to meet students that are, for example, chair bound in some capacity, and to really understand, oh, well, if this is a tradition that really is, as Pattabhi Jois said, for everyone, then it's the leaders of our community, I think, that really that need to be equipping ourselves with the tools to sort of like champion the message of accessibility, and also have the student come in and say, well, this is how you can adapt this asana for the chair. And I should say, if we bring up accessibility outside of the Ashtanga tradition, I always need to just really acknowledge Divana Heyman, who is this pioneer in accessible yoga, who started teaching accessibility because he was offering yoga to terminally ill AIDS patients, and there were some individuals who were chair bound, and so this was kind of the really the impetus to say, well, how can we make this truly accessible, because this person's never getting up out of the wheelchair. And then that just expanded to this sort of wide umbrella of accessibility of so many people that just are not physically able to ever cross their feet, pick it up, and jump back. And yoga is Pattabhi Jois Guruji always said, yoga is for everyone who wants it, and I really love that conversation is normalized now.
And it's reminding me, many, many years ago, we had this remarkable woman who had cerebral palsy, who somehow found our studio where we practiced Mysore class. And it was the only yoga that she could do, because she had a body that was so different from anyone else's. And for her to just get in the door, get her mat out of the cubby and put it out, was just this effort. And then she would sit there and she would move in whatever way she was able to move, and we worked with her to make it work for her. And being on a mat near her and watching this woman with, as you were talking about devotion and dedication, Kino, earlier, she had this incredible devotion to this system and to the fact that this system was allowing her to become embodied. And then you'd be on your mat next to her thinking, why can't I get my leg behind my head? And then you'd look over and go, yeah, And so it was this amazing thing where students, then really came together because of seeing the differences. And she was so thrilled to see the person next to her who struggled for 6 months finally get their leg behind the head. That wasn't like, so it's an amazing part of the practice. And it's so good that that's, coming back into the forefront as it needed to.
That kind of goes back to, I think, what I was going to ask in the very beginning is, what is the tradition that that brings us together? And I think you're sort of answering that. And it's easy to mistaken the tradition as a sequence, a set sequence, certain poses, series, or whatever. But what I'm hearing you all saying is, no, it's teaching the person in front of you. It's sharing the practice in a way that fits the individual.
And then the other part to that is that it isn't just a free for all. And and that's the other side of it. As soon as you say, oh, well, you just do your own thing, then it becomes something that really doesn't have the element of a discipline that is an important part of any kind of practice. It's spoken of in Buddhist practices and yoga practices, as there is an element of devotion, there's an element of effort and of integrity that one brings. And so finding that within this is, is really how the practice sort of blossoms, I think.
Yeah, there is a religious quality to it, but that's part of what human beings are. You can't live without every human is religious. They just have thousands of variations. So even atheism is a big religion. It's a presumption. And so it's just acknowledging that and then finding that patterning that allows you to focus your mind and to pay attention to what's going on. And if it's a shared belief that has evolved, it's a way of focusing the mind on the mystery of what is really important. And so there are many variations on that. And you can't not do that. And so even someone who's, it's like atheism is, but I have atheist friends who are much more religious and spiritual than a lot of my theistic friends. And they're much more in awe of the universe, and they're much kinder and honest than some of my, religious fanatic friends, and vice versa. And so that's what, is a beauty in the evolution of Ashtanga Vinyasa, is that it's a methodology that has the best of both qualities.
I love that. That is
Did that come through?
it's not the answer that everyone wants, by the way. It's not the and answer everyone wants. What we really want to hear you say is like one way or the other, and this is how it will be, or this is how it is. And that's not what I'm hearing anyone's. And that's of course the complexity of all of this, and of being human and being alive. And anyway, I appreciate the four of you speaking to all of that. And actually there's a lot of comfort in that for me. That it is both, and it is all. And whether you're talking about structure and individualization, or if you're talking about, I don't know, just even all the areas of grief, the complexities of grief, and how that feels. And definitely we're standing in a threshold right now, and thresholds are powerful places, and they're scary. They're a little scary, but I do think that we don't walk through those alone. And it feels really good to have you all here with me through this one. Yeah. So thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Ashtanga Dispatch podcast. And listen, it would be fantastic if you could share this podcast with your friends or on social media, and keep this connection through yoga alive and thriving. Plus, you'd be helping to support this very grassroots mom and pop production. Next on the podcast, you'll get to hear David Kyle, Scott Johnson, Jen Renee, and me talk a little shop as teachers as we discuss whether Ashtanga Yoga is actually for everyone. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you then.